Hi, Bill here. I'd like to talk about some of the tactics you can use to draw a game, and one of the best resources is Perpetual check. So this is when you keep checking forever. So Perpetual check can be a good resource in a worse position, or sometimes even in an equal or better position. Say for example you were very short of time. Okay, so let's have a look. So this is a very common Perpetual check. The king is wide open. The best square to get a perpetual check with is the queen. So in this case the queen just shuffles backwards and forwards. So some perpetual checks happen on two squares, so the checking piece will just oscillate between two squares. So here's a slightly unusual perpetual check with a knight, with the knight oscillating between two squares. Here's a perpetual check with a rook, assisted by the king. Okay, so white gives check and keeps checking. It's rare that a bishop gives perpetual check, but here's an example. So bishop moves in check, king only has one square, bishop check, and so on until it's triple repetition. This time the rook is on the 7th rank, cutting the king off. Keep in mind these positions are just fragments, because sometimes I don't always have two kings on the board, and they're to illustrate perpetual check patterns. They're not saying that perpetual check is the best move in the position. So you'll notice after white gives check, this king could shuffle to any square along the back rank, any of these four squares. But for every square, the rook will have a corresponding checking square. So it takes a bit longer, but eventually the position will reach triple repetition. Though normally, of course, if both players are experienced and see it's perpetual check, they will just agree to it all. Now, this is a perpetual check which is a little different. Rather than a piece oscillating on two squares, and rather the piece checks on three different squares. So the black king doesn't move, so white's plan is to stop the black king from moving. So black has the choice of blocking the check with a queen or bishop. So white gives a check, queen must block. So white has the choice of, black has the choice of blocking with the bishop or the queen. Bishop blocks. Now the queen checks on the third square. So the queen checks on either e8, e5 or h5, depending on which of those squares are safe. So this one's a bit like the one with the queen checking when the black rook is here and the white king is here. So this time, instead of checking on the rank, the white queen moves up the file. So the black king's going to oscillate between h8 and h7, and the white queen's going to oscillate on f7 and f8. This is perpetual check where slightly more complex, because the black king has a choice of different squares, so white will be checking on different squares. So we start off with queen g5, king moves across, and we can check back on f6 or h6, probably a bit more to the point. Okay, so here's one where the pawn's next to the king. So the queen oscillates between h8 and e8. Sorry, h5 and e8. Slightly unusual perpetual check, where similar to the last one, except the queen is moved over one square and black has doubled knight's pawns. So check, king goes back, check, and there's nothing black can do to escape perpetual. Okay, This one is a good one to know. I saw a game once where a player had a long variation which could have led to this position. And if you can recognise this instantly perpetual check, it's a big help in those cases because the player was short of time and he didn't play into it. So it's good to know this is perpetual check. So white checks on f5. And if the king goes back, we check back on c8. And the other thing black could have done is, after white checks on f5, he moves the pawn forward, the queen will take, and again it would be perpetual check by moving on f7 and f8. Another perpetual check with the rook. Now, white has lots of discovered checks. But say, for example, as in this case, the having two moves in a row of the bishop doesn't lead to anything because black has his queen on a black square. The bishop can move to any one of a number of squares, and after the king moves, white can force the king back into the discovered check, back into the line of the queen. So that's a perpetual check. There's a perpetual check with a discovered check with a bishop and rook. White's got a choice of squares with the bishop. When the king moves, bishop checks, forcing the king back into the line of the rook. Another perpetual check with the bishop and knight. If white had a queen instead of a bishop, this would lead to mate, but in this case, it's just perpetual check. Now, it's a slightly funny one. The white rook has to be on d7 for this to work. So the knight checks, the king moves, knight checks. Now the king goes into the corner, it's mating one with the rook. So the king must go to the f8, check. King tries to sneak out the other way. But what white does is, when the knight checks, the knight defends the rook at the same time. So this position is perpetual check. And I knew about this position, but I noticed it was in the classic book, Basic Chess Endings. Note it doesn't work if the white rook is on a different square, for example, c7. This time, we've got discovered checks with the knight. So, white's got a choice of ways of doing it. The knight could go to another square, but the point is, after the king goes to h7, knight checks again. Because the king cannot escape, king must go back into the line of the rook. And we have perpetual check. Here's another one with two rooks. If the black rook were here, white would have mating 3, starting rook, check, and the other rook mates. But when there's no mate, as in this case, the rooks have been called the blind swine. So here the blind swine have perpetual check. Note that if white had another piece defending the g7 square, for example, if he had a pawn here, he could checkmate by swinging this rook over, king across, and rook down mate. Another perpetual check with the rooks. Note that you can have similar perpetual checks with this second rook being on any of these ranks. Okay, so the classic one with the queen against the king. Classic one with the pawn against the king. And queen has perpetual check against the king. Perpetual check. Okay, so I'll just back up a bit. So here there's a perpetual check with the rook and bishop. So there's a discovered check. So the first thing white's got to do is stop the rook taking the bishop. So the rook moves, gives check, and then it's perpetual check. Thank you for watching.